The convoy was already running 30 minutes late when she appeared. Firebase Kestrel sat at the edge of the Mekong Delta like a rusted nail driven into the earth, functional, ugly, and permanent in the way that only desperate things manage to be. It was the kind of forward operating base that didn't appear on tourist maps or military press releases. It existed because the war demanded it, and the war demanded everything eventually. The morning air was dense and wet, carrying the particular smell of Vietnam that soldiers never forgot and never quite managed to describe, rot and rain and something older underneath, something the jungle had been breathing long before any of them arrived. Captain David Mercer stood at the southern checkpoint with a cigarette he hadn't lit and a mission briefing he had already memorized. 32 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with close-cropped brown hair and the kind of eyes that had stopped being surprised by things 2 deployments ago. He had been in-country for 14 months. He had learned to read the Delta the way a sailor reads open water, not by looking at it directly, but by feeling the way it pushed back. This morning, it was pushing back hard. The mission was designated Operation Iron Shepherd, a cargo escort run from Firebase Kestrel to Firebase Longbow, 40 miles northeast through some of the most hostile jungle terrain in the entire III Corps tactical zone. The cargo itself was locked in a reinforced crate in the bed of the second vehicle and classified well above Mercer's pay grade. He had been told it was critical. He had been told speed mattered. He had been told not to ask further questions, and he had learned long ago that those 3 pieces of information together meant whatever was in that crate was important enough to get people killed over. His unit was good. He knew that. 12 Special Forces soldiers, hand-picked, experienced, the kind of men who communicated in half-sentences and trusted each other with the uncomplicated faith of people who had run out of alternatives. Staff Sergeant Ray Hollies anchored the rear element, a broad-shouldered Georgian with a jaw like poured concrete, and instincts so sharp they bordered on supernatural. Lieutenant Frank Cho handled intelligence, quiet and precise, the kind of man who read enemy transmissions the way other men read novels. Corporal James Tully managed communications, reliable and unremarkable. The rest were solid professionals operating in a place that punished anything less. The delay had come from the refugees. They had gathered at the checkpoint gate as the convoy was loading, a wave of displaced Vietnamese civilians seeking passage northeast, away from a village that had apparently stopped existing sometime in the previous 48 hours. Women with infants wrapped against their chests, old men leaning on sticks cut from the jungle, faces mapped with the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than physical, children with eyes that had already processed more tragedy than most adults ever would. The Delta was full of them, the human wreckage of a war that didn't distinguish between combatants and the landscape they moved through. Mercer was studying the faces. It was habit now, involuntary, the same way a man checks a lock he's already checked, when she materialized from the middle of the crowd. She didn't push forward. She didn't call attention to herself. She simply moved through the mass of people with a quiet, fluid efficiency that parted the crowd without disturbing it, the way water moves around stone. Small, wrapped in a mud-stained shawl the color of the Delta soil, black hair pulled back and tucked beneath a fraying cloth. She carried a canvas sack against her chest with both arms, the way a person carries something they cannot afford to put down, and in her right hand she held a child's doll, porcelain face cracked diagonally from forehead to chin, one painted eye chipped to bare ceramic. The doll was the kind of thing a child had once treasured and then lost, and someone else had picked up and carried for reasons that probably had nothing to do with sentiment. She looked like grief wearing human clothing. She looked like every other woman in that crowd and nothing like any of them. Hollies appeared at Mercer's shoulder with the silent materialization he had perfected over years of operating in terrain where making noise meant making problems. He was chewing the dead end of an unlit cigarette, eyes moving across the crowd with the flat, efficient scan of a man who sorted people into categories and trusted his sorting completely. "Another batch wanting passage, Captain," he said quietly. "Mostly women, kids, elderly, probably harmless." "Probably," Mercer said. It was the word he always used when something didn't sit right but he couldn't prove why. Hollis recognized it and said nothing. They both watched the crowd, and both, at the exact same moment, found their eyes returning to the woman with the doll. She had stopped moving. She was standing perfectly still at the edge of the crowd, canvas sack held against her chest, and she was looking at the tree line. Not glancing, looking, with the focused, unhurried attention of someone reading fine print at a distance. Her eyes tracked slowly from left to right along the jungle's edge, paused at a specific point in the shadowed green, held there for exactly 3 seconds, then continued. It was the kind of observation that had a name in Special Forces training: threat assessment. Systematic, practiced, professional. Mercer felt the cigarette bend between his fingers. "She's not looking for safety," he said, almost to himself. "No," Hollis agreed, his voice dropping a register. "She's looking for something she already knows is there." The moment stretched between them, that particular suspended quality of a decision that knows it cannot be undone. Behind the woman, 40 displaced civilians waited with the patient, terrible endurance of people who had learned that waiting was simply what survival looked like. Mercer could not turn them away. Not out here. Not today. The Delta had enough unmarked graves without him adding to the count through bureaucratic caution. But he didn't take his eyes off her as he spoke. "Grant them passage," he said. "Keep the group at the rear vehicle, standard search before boarding." He paused. "And Hollis, don't let her out of your sight, not for a single second." Hollis already had his eyes fixed on her. "Already handled, sir." The gates opened. The refugees filed through in quiet, exhausted procession. The woman moved with them, not first, not last, perfectly centered in the group, just another face in the nameless tide. But as she passed the checkpoint, she slowed almost imperceptibly for a fraction of a second, and her eyes moved, not to the soldiers, not to the cargo truck, not to Hollis standing 4 feet away with his hand resting meaningfully on his rifle. She looked directly at Mercer. For one single, suspended moment, their eyes met. Hers were dark and deep and entirely, unsettlingly calm, the eyes of someone who had not been startled by anything in a very long time. There was no fear in them, no plea, no performance of the vulnerability that the situation called for, just a look that contained something Mercer couldn't name in the moment and would spend years afterward trying to. Then she looked away, tucked her chin, continued walking. Hollis fell in behind her like a shadow. The convoy engines turned over one by one, the sound rolling out across the fire base and into the jungle beyond. Mercer climbed into the lead vehicle, unfolded his map across the dash, and looked at the 40 miles of green nothing that stood between them and Firebase Longbow. His hand traced the route, the river crossing at mile 10, the open terrain at mile 23, the narrow mountain passage at mile 37 that the unit had taken to Calling Devil's Notch, because the men who named things in the field always had an instinct for the truth. He folded the map, checked his watch, looked once more at the tree line. Somewhere out in that breathing, indifferent green, something that had been watching Firebase Kestrel for 3 days registered the convoy's departure with calm, professional satisfaction, and began to move. The gate closed behind the last vehicle. Iron Shepherd rolled northeast into the delta, and the jungle closed around it like a hand. 10 miles in, the radios started lying. It began as nothing, the kind of soft interference that equipment produced naturally in humid air, a low hiss beneath the standard channel that made operators tap their headsets and assume weather. The Delta had a way of corrupting transmissions, bending frequencies, turning clear signals into garbled static that sounded like the jungle itself was trying to speak. Most soldiers learned to ignore it. Most soldiers didn't have Lieutenant Frank Cho's ears. Cho sat hunched in the back of the second vehicle, headset pressed tight against his skull, eyes closed, listening with the particular intensity of a man trying to hear something beneath something else. He was 31 years old, second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, with a degree in linguistics he'd never planned to use in a war zone, and a gift for pattern recognition that had kept him alive through 18 months of intercepting enemy communications. He didn't hear words the way other people did. He heard structure, cadence, the space between syllables where meaning lived. And right now, buried beneath the static on their primary channel, he was hearing Vietnamese. Not random chatter, not ambient bleed from a distant frequency, coordinated transmissions, controlled, deliberate. Someone was talking about the convoy, using terminology that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking at. Vehicle count, cargo designation, route projection, and one phrase that made the sweat on Cho's neck turn cold despite the jungle heat. M letter 1E5C, Tier Uzak, NH letter 1EADN, CH letter 1EC9 Hyla Mercer. Target confirmed, Commander is Mercer. Cho yanked the headset off and was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped moving. Mercer was already halfway down the convoy line, eyes scanning the tree line with the automatic vigilance of a man who had learned that the moment you relaxed was the moment the jungle took something from you. He saw Cho approaching at speed and knew immediately. Cho didn't move fast unless something was breaking. Captain, Cho's voice was tight, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it sharp enough to cut. We have a problem. He handed Mercer the printed transcription, fragmented, incomplete, but clear enough. Mercer read it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. The coordinates referenced in the transmission didn't match any known NVA grid position. Not even close. They were referencing terrain that shouldn't have had enemy presence according to every intelligence brief Mercer had received in the past 72 hours. Either our maps are wrong, Cho said quietly, or the enemy isn't where we think they are. Or both, Mercer finished. He looked up at the jungle pressing close on both sides of the narrow dirt road, dense, dripping, impenetrable. Somewhere in that green wall, someone was watching them. Someone had been watching them for a while, long enough to know his name. How long have they been tracking us? Mercer asked. Hard to say. The transmission suggests they've had eyes on the convoy since we left Kestrel, but the frequency modulation indicates they've been positioned in this area for at least. Cho stopped mid-sentence, his expression shifting. Sir, they're not following us. They're waiting for us. The words settled into Mercer's chest like stones. He ordered the convoy to halt at the river crossing, a narrow, shallow run of brown water that cut across the road beneath a canopy so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground. It was defensible terrain, relatively speaking, and they needed time to recalibrate. He climbed out of the lead vehicle and signaled Hollies forward with a sharp gesture. Soldiers dismounted, weapons up, forming a loose perimeter around the halted vehicles. The jungle was never silent: birds, insects, the constant drip of water from leaves. But there was a quality to the sound now that felt wrong, the way a room feels wrong when someone has just left it. Hollies arrived with his rifle slung low and his eyes already moving across the tree line. Talk to me, Captain. We have enemy transmissions suggesting they know our route, our vehicle count, and my name. Mercer kept his voice flat, professional, but Hollies had known him long enough to hear the tension underneath. Cho thinks they're not tracking us, they're positioned ahead of us. Hollies processed that for exactly 2 seconds. Ambush. That's the read. Then we turn around. Can't, the cargo has a deadline and command made it clear that missing the window isn't an option. Mercer paused. We push forward, carefully. Hollies nodded once, the kind of nod that said he didn't like it but understood it, which in the field was the only kind of agreement that mattered. He turned to scan the perimeter and stopped. Captain, the woman. Mercer's head snapped around. The refugee group was clustered near the rear vehicle, exactly where they were supposed to be, except she wasn't with them. The woman with the doll, the one Holly's had been explicitly told not to let out of his sight, was gone. Holly's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. I had eyes on her 60 seconds ago. 4 soldiers swept the convoy perimeter in under 2 minutes, moving fast and quiet, checking under vehicles, behind supply crates, inside the tree line's edge. Private Reyes found her crouched low behind the rear supply truck, partially concealed by a stack of ammunition crates. She wasn't hiding exactly, she was positioned. Knees bent, weight balanced, one hand braced against the truck frame, the other resting on the canvas sack in her lap. And her eyes were locked on a specific point in the tree line, 200 meters northeast. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't panicking. She was studying something with the calm, methodical focus of someone conducting a surveillance operation. On your feet, now. Holly's had his rifle up, voice like gravel scraping across iron, hands where I can see them. She rose slowly, movements economical, hands open at her sides. The canvas sack and the cracked porcelain doll hung from her left hand. She looked at Holly's the way a chess player looks at a piece being moved by someone who doesn't understand the board, not with contempt, but with a kind of detached assessment that was somehow more unsettling. Mercer arrived within seconds, Cho half a step behind him. Who are you? Why did you leave the group? She said nothing. Her eyes drifted briefly, precisely, back to that same point in the tree line, 200 meters northeast. Then she lowered her gaze and went silent, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like she was choosing not to speak rather than unable to. Cho stepped closer, studying her face with the same intensity he used on enemy transmissions. Captain, her posture. I see it, Mercer cut him off. She was standing the way soldiers stood, weight distributed, hands positioned for quick movement, eyes tracking terrain with systematic efficiency. This wasn't a frightened refugee. This was someone who had been trained. Cho pulled Mercer aside and handed him a second printout, the final fragment from the enemy transmission, decoded 10 minutes prior. Mercer read it and felt the temperature drop 10 degrees despite the jungle heat. 4 words in English. Spotter already inside convoy. The river moved quietly beneath them, brown water sliding over smooth stones. The jungle breathed its endless, indifferent breath, and every man on Iron Shepherd suddenly found himself looking at the person standing next to him, just a little differently than he had 60 seconds before. Holly's kept his rifle on the woman, but his eyes moved briefly to Tully at the radio, to Reyes checking his weapon, to the other soldiers scattered across the perimeter. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. Captain, if there's a spotter in this convoy feeding intel to the enemy, and she knew exactly where to look for them in the tree line, then either she's the spotter, Mercer said quietly, or she's hunting the same people we are. The woman stood perfectly still, canvas sack in hand, and said nothing. But her eyes moved once more, not to the soldiers, not to the vehicles, not to the weapons pointed in her direction. Back to the tree line, 200 meters northeast, watching something none of them could see. Watching something that was watching them back. Mercer made a decision he knew he'd be second-guessing for the rest of the mission. Restrain her, keep her with the convoy, we move in 5. Holly zip-tied her wrists without ceremony and guided her back toward the refugee group. She didn't resist, didn't protest, just walked with that same quiet efficiency, like being detained was simply another variable in an equation she was still calculating. The convoy engines turned over, the soldiers remounted, the river crossing passed beneath them without incident. But 10 miles ahead, in a mountain pass the soldiers had named Devil's Notch, 12 men with NVA insignia and professional-grade weapons were finishing their final preparations, checking sight lines, synchronizing watches, and waiting for the convoy that had been promised to them by someone who knew exactly when it would arrive. And somewhere in the canopy above the road, something else was moving, silent, patient, and utterly invisible. The jungle closed in tighter. The radios hissed their static lies. An iron shepherd rolled deeper into the trap. By nightfall, the convoy had become a pressure cooker with a cracked lid. Mercer had ordered the unit to make camp beneath a dense canopy of jungle growth 2 miles past the river crossing, vehicles pulled into a defensive circle, sentries posted at every compass point. Fires were forbidden. Voices were kept low. The kind of operational discipline that came from men who understood that sound traveled differently in the jungle, farther, clearer, and always in directions you didn't expect. But the silence inside the camp was somehow louder than any gunshot, thick with suspicion, bristling with unspoken accusations that moved between soldiers like smoke. Hollis was convinced the woman was the enemy spotter. He had been since the river crossing, and nothing in the hours since had changed his mind. She sat now at the center of the refugee group, wrists still zip-tied, the canvas sack and cracked doll placed carefully beside her. She hadn't touched the water they'd offered, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything except sit with that same unnerving stillness and watch the tree line with eyes that never seemed to need rest. 2 other soldiers, Corporal James Tully and Private Rays, had begun eyeing each other with the particular distrust of men who had spent too long in the dark with too much bad information and not enough answers. Tully managed the radio and had access to every frequency the convoy used. Rays handled ammunition resupply and had been near the rear vehicle when the woman disappeared. Both had alibis. Both had gaps in those alibis. Both were starting to notice the way the other moved. Even Cho, normally the calmest presence in any room, was double-checking the lock on the cargo crate every 20 minutes, with the obsessive focus of someone trying to control the one variable he could still influence. Mercer moved through the camp quietly, watching everything, saying little. Command had always come naturally to him, not because he was loud or charismatic, but because he was steady. Men trusted steady. They trusted a voice that didn't rise in pitch when things went wrong, a set of orders that came from assessment rather than panic. But tonight, steady felt like the hardest thing he'd ever been asked to maintain. He could feel the unit fracturing beneath him, fault lines opening between men who had operated as a single organism for months. Trust was the only currency that mattered in the field, and someone was spending it faster than he could replenish it. At 200 hours, the eastern perimeter sentry was found dead. Private First Class Marcus Webb, 23 years old, 3rd deployment, from a small town in Nebraska whose name Mercer couldn't pronounce but whose location Webb had described in enough detail that Mercer felt like he'd been there. Webb was reliable. Webb followed protocol. Webb checked in every 15 minutes like clockwork. Until he didn't. Hollis found him slumped against a tree 15 meters outside the perimeter, rifle still slung across his chest, radio still clipped to his vest. No shot had been fired. No sound reported by the sentries on either side of his position. The man was simply dead, with the precise, boneless quality of someone whose life had been removed quickly and professionally. A single blade wound, angled upward beneath the ribcage, delivered with the kind of anatomical knowledge that suggested training most soldiers in the camp had never received. The kill was clean, practiced, silent. The kind of kill that required you to get very close to someone without them noticing, until it was far too late. The woman was seized immediately. Hollis conducted the interrogation himself in a small clearing 20 meters from the main camp, 3 soldiers standing perimeter while Mercer watched from the shadows. Hollis didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice stayed low and controlled, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd raised it, the voice of a man who had already decided what he believed and was simply waiting for confirmation. She sat cross-legged on the wet ground, canvas sack in her lap, wrist still bound, and said absolutely nothing for 11 minutes. Hollis asked questions in English, then in broken Vietnamese. Then he stopped asking and just watched her, the way a hunter watches an animal he's cornered but hasn't quite figured out yet. She didn't look scared, didn't look defiant. She looked patient, calm as deep water, still as stone, waiting for something with the kind of certainty that suggested she knew exactly what was going to happen next even if no one else did. Then she turned her head and looked directly at Mercer. Not Holly's, not the soldiers standing perimeter, Mercer. And she spoke, barely above a whisper, in near-perfect English with an accent that suggested expensive education rather than street learning, words chosen with the precision of someone who had been counting syllables in her head for hours waiting for this exact moment. The man who died was not killed by me. He was killed to frame me, and whoever killed him is still inside this camp. The jungle breathed around them. Somewhere distant, something moved through the trees. Could have been wind, could have been an animal, could have been the enemy closing in on coordinates they'd received from someone standing 30 feet away. The fire in Holly's eyes burned hotter. Convenient story, real convenient timing too. Ray, Mercer started. She disappears at the river, shows up exactly where she shouldn't be, watches the tree line like she's waiting for a signal, and now one of our men is dead with a kill that looks exactly like NVA close quarters doctrine. Holly's voice never rose, but it got harder, colder, edged with something that wasn't quite rage but lived in the same neighborhood. You're telling me that's coincidence, Captain? I'm telling you to let me think, Mercer said quietly. He had spent 4 years reading men in the field, reading the microscopic differences between a lie and a truth, between fear and calculation, between someone hiding something and someone carrying the weight of something they couldn't share. It was an imperfect skill. It failed constantly, but it was the only tool he had in a situation where every instrument pointed in different directions. He looked at the woman for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, without performance, without the desperate need to convince him that most people showed when accused of something they didn't do. She just looked at him the way someone looks at another person they believe might be capable of understanding something complicated if given enough time. "Why should I believe you?" Mercer asked. "You shouldn't," she said simply. "You should believe the evidence. The sentry was killed from behind while facing outward toward the tree line. That means the killer approached from inside the perimeter. I was restrained and under watch in the center of camp during that entire window." Her eyes moved briefly to Holly's, then back to Mercer. "Your sergeant knows this. He is choosing not to say it because it is easier to blame someone outside the unit than someone inside it." Holly's took a step forward. "Watch your mouth." "Ray," Mercer's voice carried command weight this time. Holly stopped, jaw working, but he stopped. Mercer crouched down so he was eye level with the woman, studying her face in the dim, filtered moonlight that barely reached through the canopy. "Who are you?" "Someone trying to keep you alive," she said quietly. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." She paused, and for the first time something that looked almost like urgency flickered across her expression. "But if you keep me restrained and waste time interrogating me while your actual threat moves freely through this camp, none of us will live long enough for the truth to matter." Mercer felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes on him, Holly's burning with certainty, Cho calculating probabilities, the other soldiers waiting for direction in a situation that had no clear direction to give. He was the captain. The decision was his. The consequences would be his. And the truth was he didn't know. He genuinely, absolutely did not know if the woman in front of him was trying to save them or systematically destroying them from within. But he knew one other thing with absolute certainty. Sitting here arguing about it while someone else moved through the dark was the worst possible option. He stood up slowly. "Keep her restrained, post 2 guards. No one approaches her without my direct authorization." He looked at Holly's. "Double the sentries, rotate every hour. No one operates alone, not for any reason." "Sir." "That's the order, Ray." Holly's held his gaze for 3 long seconds, then nodded once. Sharp, professional, disagreeing completely but trusting enough to follow anyway. The woman was escorted back to the center of camp. The additional sentries were posted. The rotation schedule was established, everything by the book, everything correct. And somewhere in the camp, someone who had just killed a man without making a sound smiled in the darkness and waited for the next opportunity. The jungle breathed, the radios hissed, and the truth, whatever it was, moved through the shadows like water through cracks, impossible to hold and impossible to stop. Mercer pulled Cho aside before dawn and told him to dig, quietly, through every back channel and secondary frequency he could access without flagging the primary command net. They stood in the pre-dawn gray between two vehicles, voices kept low enough that the words barely traveled beyond arm's reach. Around them, the camp was beginning to stir, soldiers emerging from shallow sleep, with the hollow-eyed vigilance of men who hadn't really rested, hands automatically checking weapons, eyes automatically scanning tree lines. The air smelled like wet earth and diesel, and something metallic that might have been rain coming or might have been fear. "Someone at a higher level knows something about this woman," Mercer said, handing Cho a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "I need you to find out what it is before we move another mile." Cho took the coffee without drinking it, already thinking 3 steps ahead. If she's an asset, she'd be flagged in the regional intelligence database. If she's enemy, she'd be in the target recognition files. If she's neither, then we're dealing with something that doesn't fit the categories, Mercer finished. "Which is what worries me." Cho nodded once and disappeared into the back of the communications vehicle with the focused intensity of a man defusing a bomb. He pulled out 3 different radio sets, a frequency scanner that wasn't technically authorized for field use, and a classified authentication codebook that he wasn't technically supposed to have. Then he went to work. For 2 hours he cycled through frequencies, cross-referenced unit designations, pulled fragmented signal logs from the past 72 hours. He accessed channels that required 3 separate authorization codes. He listened to dead air for 15 minutes at a time, waiting for transmission windows to open. He ran voice pattern analysis on intercepted NVA communications, looking for mentions of the convoy, the woman, anything that would connect the pieces scattered across the board. What he found, or rather, what he couldn't find, was alarming in its own right. There was no record of a female asset operating anywhere in the Mekong Delta Theater, not in current deployment rosters, not in archived mission logs, not in the regional intelligence sharing database that supposedly tracked every friendly operative within 200 kilometers. Her description matched no one. Her face, Cho had sketched it from memory with surprising accuracy, triggered no recognition protocols. It was as if she had been deliberately erased from every official ledger that existed, every paper trail burned, every digital record scrubbed. Cho leaned back in his chair and stared at the radio sets like they had personally betrayed him. In intelligence work, absence of information was itself information. But this wasn't normal absence. This was surgical removal, professional deletion. The kind of thing that required authorization from levels of government that didn't officially acknowledge their own existence. Then the backup radio crackled. Not the primary frequency, not even the secondary. A tertiary channel buried so deep in the military communications spectrum that Cho had only accessed it twice in 18 months, both times by accident. A ghost frequency. The kind that officially didn't exist and unofficially carried traffic no one was supposed to hear. The transmission came in clean and sharp, cutting through the static like a knife through silk. "Ghost Orchid is active. Do not compromise her. Acknowledge and clear." Cho's hand froze halfway to the transmit button. His pulse spiked. He played the message back 3 times to make sure he'd heard it correctly. Then he grabbed his notes and went looking for Mercer at a speed that made soldiers step out of his way without asking questions. He found the captain standing at the eastern perimeter, staring at the tree line with the expression of a man trying to read a language he didn't speak. Cho pulled him behind the lead vehicle and handed him the transcription with hands that weren't quite steady. Mercer read it twice. "Ghost Orchid." "Mean anything to you, sir?" Not a damn thing. Mercer looked up from the paper, and Cho saw something in his eyes he'd never seen before, not quite fear, but close. Uncertainty at a level that captains weren't supposed to show. But someone thinks we should know what it means. Someone with access to frequencies that aren't in any manual I've ever read. Cho nodded. I kept digging, went deeper than I probably should have. He pulled out a second set of papers, printouts from classified channels, fragments of documents that had been marked for deletion but hadn't quite disappeared yet. There's a program, buried deep in the Military Assistance Command files, joint operation with CIA, initiated in 1967, officially never acknowledged. He laid the papers out on the hood of the vehicle. Mercer leaned in, reading quickly, his expression darkening with every line. Operation Silent Garden. The program's purpose was devastating in its elegant simplicity. Identify, recruit, and train South Vietnamese women with exceptional marksmanship ability, and embed them within civilian refugee populations as deep cover intelligence assets and precision snipers. The rationale was coldly practical. Women moved through refugee flows without scrutiny, could access areas male soldiers couldn't, and were systematically underestimated by enemy forces who didn't believe women could be threats. Perfect camouflage, perfect weapons. The training protocol was brutal. 2 years of intensive preparation, marksmanship, tradecraft, survival, language, psychology. Candidates were selected not just for shooting ability but for psychological resilience, the capacity to operate completely alone, without support, without backup, without the human connection that most people needed to stay sane. Of 32 women who entered the program, only 7 graduated. Of those 7, 3 were killed within 6 months of deployment. 2 more disappeared and were presumed compromised. 1 was extracted after a psychological break that left her unable to distinguish between mission parameters and reality. That left one, codenamed Ghost Orchid. Her real name had been redacted. Her background had been redacted. Her photograph had been redacted. What remained was an operational summary that read like something from a different war entirely. 18 months in the field, operating without a handler, without a support team, without anyone to pull her out if something went wrong. Her confirmed kill count was listed simply as classified. EXCEDS standard REPORTING threshold, which in military bureaucracy meant the number was high enough that putting it in writing would raise questions no one wanted to answer. The last entry in her file was dated 6 days ago, asset active in Mekong Delta region. Mission parameters remain classified. Operational status, autonomous. Cho set the papers down and looked at Mercer. She's not a refugee, Captain. She's a weapon, one of ours, and she's been hunting something in this jungle for weeks. Mercer felt the world shift slightly beneath his feet, the way it does when you realize you've been looking at something upside down, and it suddenly inverts into clarity. The way she moved, the way she watched the tree line, the way she had positioned herself behind that supply truck at the river crossing, not hiding, but taking a tactical vantage point. The absolute calm in her eyes when Hollies had put a rifle in her face. She wasn't an enemy spotter. She was hunting the enemy spotters. And she had been doing it alone, invisible, for 3 days while the convoy rolled deeper into a trap she was trying to spring from the inside. Mercer walked back to where she sat, still restrained, still surrounded by refugees who didn't know they were sitting next to one of the most dangerous human beings in the entire theater of war. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression shifted, not relief, not vindication, just a kind of tired recognition, like she'd been waiting for this moment and was glad it had finally arrived. Mercer crouched down in front of her. Around them, soldiers watched with varying degrees of suspicion and confusion. Holly stood 10 feet away with his hand resting on his sidearm, ready to intervene if this went wrong. Ghost Orchid, Mercer said quietly. The name hung in the air between them like smoke. For 3 full seconds she said nothing. Then something shifted almost imperceptibly in her face, not surprise, not fear, just the faintest acknowledgement. The way a person reacts when someone finally calls them by their real name after a very long time of being called something else. "How long have you been tracking us?" Mercer asked. Her voice came out low and clear, each word chosen with surgical precision. 3 days. The team hunting you has been tracking you for 5. Around them, the jungle breathed. The morning light filtered down through the canopy in pale gray shafts, and every man within earshot suddenly understood that the war they thought they were fighting had just revealed itself to be something much larger, much stranger, and much more dangerous than any of them had been told. Mercer reached forward and cut her restraints with his combat knife. Hollis took a step forward. "Captain." "She's not the enemy, Ray." Mercer's voice carried absolute command weight. "She's the only reason we're still alive." Mercer made a decision that would have ended his career if anyone above his pay grade had found out. He cut her restraints himself. The knife sliced through the zip ties in one clean motion. She pulled her hands forward slowly, rubbing her wrists where the plastic had left red marks against brown skin, but her eyes never left Mercer's face. There was no gratitude in her expression, no relief, just a quiet assessment, like she was measuring him against some internal standard and deciding whether he had passed. Hollis looked like he'd been asked to swallow a live grenade. "Sir, with all due respect." "She's not the threat, Ray." Mercer kept his voice low but filled it with the kind of command weight that didn't invite discussion. "Someone else in this convoy is, and right now she's the only one who knows what's coming." The woman, Ghost Orchid, though Mercer still didn't know if that was a name or just another piece of camouflage, rose to her feet with the fluid economy of movement that came from muscles trained to operate efficiently under stress. She was small, couldn't have been more than 5'3", maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. But standing there in the gray dawn light with her hands finally free, she somehow filled more space than her physical body occupied. The soldiers standing perimeter unconsciously shifted their weight, adjusted their grips on their weapons, recalibrated their threat assessments without quite understanding why. "Thank you," she said quietly to Mercer. Then, without waiting for permission, she picked up her canvas sack and the cracked porcelain doll and walked to the hood of the nearest vehicle, spreading both items out with the careful precision of someone laying out surgical instruments. Mercer followed. Cho materialized at his shoulder. Hollis came too, still radiating skepticism but willing to listen. The rest of the unit maintained their positions, but every ear was tuned to the conversation happening at the vehicle's hood. "Talk," Mercer said simply. Ghost Orchid didn't waste time with preamble. She pulled a small, folded map from inside the canvas sack, hand-drawn, annotated in Vietnamese and English, marked with symbols that looked like standard military notation but weren't quite. She laid it flat on the hood. "The unit hunting this convoy is a ghost cell," she began, her English carrying the precise diction of someone who had learned the language in a classroom before perfecting it in the field. "They operate entirely outside official NVA command structure. No radio contact with regional headquarters, no supply chain linkage, no paper trail. 12 men, all veterans, all specialists recruited specifically for high-value interdiction missions." "What do they call themselves?" Cho asked, already pulling out a notepad. "Red Serpent." She tapped a point on the map, a narrow passage between 2 ridgelines marked with red ink. "They've been tracking Iron Shepherd since you departed Firebase Kestrel. They know your vehicle count, your cargo designation, your route projection, and," her eyes moved to Mercer, "the name of your commanding officer." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. "How?" Hollis demanded. "Because someone inside this convoy has been transmitting your position and status updates every 2 hours since departure." She said it the way someone reports the weather, factual, unemotional, stating observable reality. "Red Serpent has a source, a mole, and he's very good at his job." Mercer felt his jaw tighten. "You know who it is?" I have suspicions, not proof. She traced a line on the map with her finger, following the convoy's projected route northeast. But identification is secondary to survival at this point. Red Serpent's plan is not to hit you in open terrain. That would be wasteful. Instead, they intend to let Iron Shepherd advance to this point. She tapped the narrow passage marked in red, a choke point your soldiers call Devil's Notch. 7 miles ahead, Cho confirmed, checking his own map. Correct. The terrain creates a natural kill box, elevated positions on 3 sides, limited maneuver space, no viable exit routes under fire. Her finger moved across the map, marking positions. Red Serpent will position snipers here, here, and here. Heavy weapons team here. Command element here with clear sight lines to coordinate fire. When the convoy enters the pass, they will trigger a simultaneous 3-sided ambush from positions you cannot effectively return fire against. Holly studied the map, his tactical mind already running scenarios. We'd be dead in under 4 minutes. 3.5, Ghost Orchid corrected without emotion. I've watched them rehearse the timing. Watch them, Mercer repeated slowly. You've been inside their perimeter. I've been hunting them for 6 weeks. I know their movement patterns, their communication protocols, their standard operating procedures better than some of them know themselves. She looked up from the map, and her eyes carried the particular weight of someone who had spent a very long time completely alone in very dangerous places. Red Serpent is good, professional, disciplined. Under normal circumstances, they would not miss. What are you suggesting? Mercer asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you that unless their command structure is broken before this convoy enters Devil's Notch, every man on Iron Shepherd will die, the cargo will be seized, and Red Serpent will disappear back into the jungle before reinforcements can arrive. She paused. I can break their command structure. That's what I was sent here to do. Alone, Holly said, and it wasn't quite a question. Alone is how I work best. Cho was studying her with the analytical intensity he usually reserved for enemy transmissions. You said Red Serpent has been tracking us for 5 days. You've been tracking us for 3. That means I arrived late, she finished. I was operating in a different sector when I intercepted their communications about the convoy. By the time I repositioned and embedded myself in the refugee flow at Kestrel, they already had their surveillance network established. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I've been playing catch-up ever since, which is why I need to move now before we get any closer to the kill zone. Mercer looked at the map, at the narrow passage marked in red, at the tactical nightmare that awaited them 7 miles ahead. Every instinct he'd developed in 4 years of combat operations was screaming that walking into Devil's Notch was suicide. But the cargo had a deadline. Command had made it clear that failure wasn't an option. And the woman standing in front of him, this impossible, invisible weapon that the war had created and then pretended didn't exist, was offering them the only chance they had. "What do you need?" he asked. For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered across her face. She reached into the canvas sack and pulled out a small cloth bundle, setting it on the hood with careful reverence. "My rifle," she said simply. Holly's made a sound that was half objection, half disbelief. "Absolutely not. We're not handing a weapon to Ray." Mercer's voice cut through the objection like a blade. He was still looking at Ghost Orchid, reading her the way he'd learned to read terrain, looking for the truth beneath the surface. If she wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. She's had a dozen opportunities. Instead, she's been protecting us from an enemy we didn't even know existed. He turned to Holly's. "We're 43 men rolling into a kill box designed by professionals who have had 5 days to perfect their plan. She's one person who spent 6 weeks learning how they think." He paused. "I'll take those odds." Holly's held his gaze for a long moment, jaw working, everything in his body language screaming disagreement. But he was a good sergeant. He knew when to trust his captain even when every fiber of his being said otherwise. "Your call, sir," he said finally, "but if this goes wrong—" "Then it goes wrong on me," Mercer finished, "not you." Ghost Orchid was already unwrapping the cloth bundle. Inside were components, individual pieces of a rifle that had been disassembled with obsessive care and stored in a way that would survive river crossings, jungle humidity, and the constant jarring of convoy transport. She laid them out in precise order: stock, receiver, barrel, scope, suppressor. And one more thing. She picked up the cracked porcelain doll that had been sitting beside the canvas sack and twisted its head. The entire torso came apart in her hands, revealing a hollow interior. From inside, she extracted a small wrapped package, the firing mechanism, preserved perfectly, the single most critical component protected in the one place no one would think to look. Then her hands moved. Mercer timed it without meaning to. 87 seconds. That's how long it took her to transform a collection of parts into a fully functional precision rifle. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Every action practiced to the point of muscle memory, executed with the smooth efficiency of someone who had assembled this weapon so many times in so many different conditions that it had become less a learned skill and more an extension of her nervous system. She raised it once, checked the scope alignment against a point in the distant tree line, made a microscopic adjustment, and lowered it. The soldiers who had watched the entire process stood in silence. Even Hollis, who trusted almost nothing, looked impressed despite himself. "Modified Mosin Nagant," Ghost Orchid said, more to herself than to them. "Suppressed. Accuracy confirmed to 900 meters in low wind." She looked up at the sky, reading the air. "This morning there is low wind." Mercer made the call. "Take it, but before you move." He pointed to the refugee group still huddled near the rear vehicle, watching the proceedings with wide, frightened eyes. "What about them?" "They stay with the convoy," she said immediately. "Under guard, protected. They have nothing to do with this." Her expression hardened. "But if your mole tries to use them as cover for another transmission, your sergeant should shoot him without hesitation." "Noted," Hollis muttered. Ghost Orchid slung the rifle across her back and picked up the empty canvas sack, folding it with the same careful precision she'd used for everything else. Then she looked at Mercer one more time. "I will move into the canopy before first light. I will shadow the convoy from the ridge above the road. You will not see me. You will not hear me. Do not fire into the tree line unless I signal." She held up the backup radio they'd given her. 3 short clicks on your secondary channel means I've made contact with Red Serpent's forward elements and am engaging. After that, drive fast and don't stop for anything until you're through Devil's Notch." "And the mole?" Mercer asked quietly. Her eyes moved briefly, precisely, to Corporal Tully standing near the communications vehicle, adjusting a frequency dial with just a little too much focus. "Watch your radio operator," she said, barely above a whisper. "He changes frequency every time the convoy slows down, always the same interval, always the same duration. That's not standard comm protocol, that's reporting." Mercer's blood went cold. He'd worked with Tully for 8 months, trusted him with communications that could get the entire unit killed if mishandled. The idea that the threat had been sitting 3 feet away from him the entire time felt like swallowing broken glass. Ghost Orchid walked to the jungle's edge. The sun was just beginning to break through the canopy, sending pale shafts of light down through the green cathedral of leaves and vines. She paused for one single moment without looking back. "Captain," she said quietly, "when this is over you never saw me. No report, no name, no record." "I understand," Mercer replied. She nodded once, then she stepped into the darkness between the trees. Within 4 steps she was invisible. Within 10 she was simply gone, absorbed by the jungle as completely as if the earth had opened up and taken her back into itself. One moment she was there, solid and real. The next she was smoke, shadow, memory. Holly stood beside Mercer, staring at the empty tree line. "I still don't like it," he muttered. You don't have to like it, Mercer said, his eyes moving to Tully across the camp. Start the engines. We move in 10. And 3 miles above the road, Ghost Orchid was already climbing into position, rifle on her back, eyes reading terrain, mind calculating angles and distances and wind drift, preparing to do what she'd been trained for 18 months to do completely alone. Hunt the hunters. The convoy rolled northeast at 7:10 hours, and every man aboard felt the weight of what was coming. Mercer sat in the lead vehicle with his hand resting on the radio and his eyes locked on the road ahead. The jungle pressed close on both sides, dense, dripping, indifferent. Morning mist hung in the air like suspended breath, turning the tree line into something between solid and shadow. Somewhere up in that green cathedral, Ghost Orchid was moving parallel to the convoy, invisible, silent, a weapon that had learned to become part of the landscape itself. He tried not to think about how much he was trusting someone he'd known for less than 12 hours. Behind him, Cho monitored the radio frequencies with headphones pressed tight against his skull, listening for the enemy transmissions that would tell them Red Serpent was repositioning, adapting, responding to the fact that something in their plan had changed. So far, nothing, just clean air and static, which meant either Ghost Orchid hadn't made contact yet, or she was hunting so quietly that even the enemy didn't know they were being hunted. Hollis rode in the second vehicle, positioned where he could watch Tully without being obvious about it. The radio operator sat hunched over his equipment, seemingly focused on routine channel management, adjusting frequencies and logging signal strength like he'd done 1,000 times before. But Hollis was watching the intervals now, watching the pattern. And Ghost Orchid had been right. Every time the convoy slowed for terrain, every time they navigated a difficult section of road, Tully's hand drifted to a specific frequency dial and made a small, precise adjustment. 2 seconds, 3 at most, then back to normal operations. Reporting intervals. Hollis felt his jaw tighten. He'd shared meals with this man, trusted him with communications that kept the unit alive. And the whole time Tully had been feeding their position to an enemy kill team like breadcrumbs leading to a slaughterhouse. The convoy pushed deeper into the jungle, 5 miles from Devil's Notch, 4-3. At 8:03 hours, the backup radio clicked 3 times. Short, sharp, deliberate. Mercer's hand tightened on the radio receiver. Around him, every soldier who'd been briefed on the signal felt their pulse spike simultaneously. Ghost Orchid had made contact. Somewhere up in the canopy, the hunt had begun. All vehicles, Mercer said into the primary channel, keeping his voice level and professional. Maintain speed. Stay tight. Eyes on the tree line, but do not fire unless you have a confirmed threat at ground level. Acknowledge. 4 confirmations came back in sequence. The convoy's speed increased slightly, not enough to look like panic, but enough to close the distance to Devil's Notch faster. The plan was simple in the way that all terrible plans were simple. Drive straight into the kill zone while Ghost Orchid systematically dismantled Red Serpent's ability to execute the ambush. Trust that one invisible woman with a rifle could do what an entire platoon couldn't. Trust or die. Mile marker 36 passed. The terrain was changing now, the road beginning to narrow as the ridgelands rose on either side. The jungle canopy grew thicker, darker, blocking out more of the sky. The temperature seemed to drop despite the humidity. Every man in the convoy felt it, that animal awareness that said predators were close, hidden, waiting. That's when Hollis noticed the bodies. He saw the first one because he was specifically looking for it. A shape that didn't quite belong in the tree line, positioned on an elevated outcropping about 300 meters northeast. It took him several seconds to process what he was seeing. An NVA spotter, wearing the mottled camouflage that Red Serpent favored, slumped forward against a tree trunk with his rifle still slung across his chest, and his head tilted at an angle that didn't support life. No gunshot, no sound, just gone. Hollis scanned the ridgeline systematically, using the scope on his rifle, and found 2 more. Another spotter, 200 meters further east. A heavy weapons operator positioned where he would have had perfect enfilade fire down the length of the convoy, now sprawled behind his RPG launcher with the stillness of someone whose off switch had been found and flipped. She was working. Ghost Orchid was systematically eliminating Red Serpent's forward observation network, picking off the men who were supposed to call the shots, coordinate the ambush, direct fire onto the convoy's most vulnerable points. She was doing it in complete silence, from distances that most snipers wouldn't attempt in perfect conditions, threading shots through jungle canopy thick enough to stop light. And Red Serpent didn't know it was happening yet. Hollis keyed his radio to Mercer's frequency. "Captain, I'm seeing enemy positions on the eastern ridge, multiple KIA. No visible wounds from this distance, but they're down and they're not moving." "Confirmed," came Cho's voice from the second vehicle. "Western ridge showing similar. I count at least 4 positions that should be active but aren't." Mercer allowed himself the smallest moment of relief. She was buying them time, buying them a chance. The question was whether she could break enough of Red Serpent's structure before the enemy realized what was happening and adapted. That question was answered 2 minutes later, when the NVA command frequency exploded with traffic. Cho ripped off his headphones like they'd burned him. "They know, Captain, they know something's wrong. I'm hearing emergency repositioning orders, multiple teams reporting lost contact with forward observers." Inside the third vehicle, Corporal Tully made his move. He lunged for the secondary radio, the backup channel that wasn't supposed to be active, the one that Hollis had been watching for the past hour. His hands moved with desperate speed, flipping switches, adjusting frequencies, bringing the transmitter live. He got the microphone to his mouth and started transmitting in rapid Vietnamese, coordinates and warnings and status updates all compressed into a single frantic burst. He got exactly 4 words out before Hollis's forearm came across his throat from behind. The radio clattered to the floor. Tully made a choking sound and drove his elbow back hard into Hollis's ribs, connecting with enough force to crack something. Hollis grunted but held on, dragging Tully backward away from the radio with strength born from months of carrying equipment through jungle terrain. They crashed into the equipment rack together, metal bending, supplies scattering. Tully was smaller, but he fought with the desperate energy of a man who knew he was out of options. He clawed at Hollis's arm, kicked backward, twisted his body trying to break free. The vehicle swerved as the driver reacted to the struggle. Other soldiers moved to help, but the space was too confined, bodies packed too tight. Hollis adjusted his grip, got his weight positioned, and drove Tully down onto the vehicle floor with enough force to rattle teeth. Private Reyes dropped down and pinned Tully's legs. Another soldier grabbed his arms. "Zip ties," Hollis barked, breathing hard, blood running from where Tully had connected with his mouth. "Now." Tully was secured in under 30 seconds, flex-cuffed at wrists and ankles, shoved into the corner of the vehicle where he couldn't reach any equipment. He didn't say anything, didn't protest or explain or beg, just stared at Hollis with eyes that had gone flat and cold, all pretense burned away, nothing left but the thing underneath. Hollis picked up the secondary radio from where it had fallen. The transmit light was still active. He had no idea how much Tully had managed to send before being stopped, but it had been enough to reach someone. Somewhere out in the jungle, Red Serpent had just received a warning that their carefully constructed ambush was compromised. He keyed the radio to Mercer's frequency. "Captain, mole is contained, but he got a transmission out. Partial, maybe 10 seconds. I don't know what he said." Mercer's voice came back tight and controlled. "Understood. All vehicles increase speed. We're not stopping until we're through the notch." The convoy accelerated, engines roaring, vehicles bouncing over the deteriorating road surface as speed took priority over comfort. The jungle blurred on either side. The ridgelines rose higher, closer, squeezing the road into the narrow passage that would become Devil's Notch in another mile. On the eastern ridge, a Red Serpent squad leader named Nguyen Van Duck was making calculations that would determine whether he lived through the next 10 minutes. He'd lost contact with 4 forward observers. His heavy weapons team wasn't responding. His command frequency was full of conflicting reports and fragmentary information that didn't make sense. Something, was systematically destroying his operational network, and he couldn't see what was doing it. He made the decision that any good tactical commander would make: adapt, improvise, execute the ambush early with the resources he still had before he lost anything else. He raised his radio and gave the order to fire. 1 mile from Devil's Notch, the jungle exploded. The first RPG screamed in from the eastern ridge and detonated against the rear supply truck with a flash that turned the world white. The explosion echoed through the pass like thunder trapped in a bottle. Secondary detonations followed: rifle fire, machine gun bursts, the distinctive crack of AK-47s fired from elevated positions. Red Serpent was professional. They'd trained for this. But they were firing with half their planned positions already eliminated, coordination disrupted, sight lines compromised by the loss of their forward observers. Under normal circumstances, Iron Shepherd would have been destroyed in 4 minutes. But Ghost Orchid had already made sure these weren't normal circumstances. Mercer gripped the wheel and drove, the lead vehicle's engine screaming as they accelerated into the kill zone. Around him, bullets tore through vegetation and ricocheted off armor plating. The radio was full of voices: soldiers calling contacts, medics responding to wounded, officers trying to maintain formation in chaos. And then from somewhere high on the northern ridge, a single shot rang out. Different from the others, quieter, cleaner, the suppressed crack of a precision rifle fired by someone who didn't miss. Red Serpent's field commander, the man coordinating fire from an elevated position with perfect sight lines down the entire pass, dropped from his perch like a puppet with cut strings. 800 meters, through smoke, through rain that had started falling in heavy sheets, through jungle canopy that should have made the shot impossible. Ghost Orchid had found him. The enemy fire stuttered. Coordination collapsed. Squads that had been operating as a single organism suddenly became individual units trying to make decisions without central command. Some kept firing. Some repositioned. Some hesitated, confused by the silence from positions that should have been directing them. Iron Shepherd drove through the chaos like a blade through water, not unscathed, but moving, fighting, holding formation. 2 soldiers wounded. 1 vehicle smoking but still operational. Hollies returned fire from the second vehicle, controlled bursts aimed at muzzle flashes on the western ridge. The firefight raged for 11 more minutes, brutal, close, terrifying. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it went quiet. The enemy fire stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The jungle held its breath. Rain hammered the vehicle roofs. An Iron Shepherd rolled through the far end of Devil's Notch and back into open terrain, battered but intact, all 43 men still breathing. Mercer sat in the driver's seat, hands still white-knuckled on the wheel, engine still running at full speed. Behind him, his men were conducting ammunition counts, checking wounded, processing the fact that they'd just survived something that should have killed them all. He picked up the backup radio and held down the transmit key 3 times. 3 clicks back, faint, distant, already moving away. Then nothing. Ghost Orchid was gone. The pass looked exactly as dangerous as it sounded. Devil's Notch was a quarter-mile stretch of road carved between 2 steep jungle ridges, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles abreast, flanked by dense elevated terrain that gave any concealed shooter a perfect killing field from 3 directions simultaneously. The road's surface was broken and uneven, forcing the convoy to slow to a crawl even as every instinct screamed to drive faster. Dense vegetation choked both sides, creating walls of green that could hide an entire company without revealing a single position. Mercer had driven through worse terrain in his 4 years in country. He told himself that twice as the lead vehicle approached the mouth of the pass, and he didn't believe it either time. The convoy entered at 8:40 hours under a sky that had turned the color of old bruises. For 90 seconds, nothing happened. The vehicles crawled forward, engines low, soldiers leaning out of windows with rifles ready, eyes sweeping the ridgelines with the systematic intensity of men who knew they were being watched. The silence was the particular kind that doesn't feel like quiet. It feels like something holding its breath before it screams. The air smelled like rain and cordite, and something else underneath, fear, maybe, or just the particular electrical charge that builds in the atmosphere before violence erupts. Mercer's hands were steady on the wheel, but his pulse hammered in his throat. Behind him, Cho monitored 3 different radio frequencies simultaneously, listening for the transmission that would tell them Red Serpent was repositioning, adapting, preparing to spring what was left of their trap. The enemy command frequency had gone eerily quiet 30 seconds ago. That was worse than chatter. Silence meant someone was making final preparations. In the second vehicle, Hollis kept his rifle trained on the eastern ridge while keeping Tully in his peripheral vision. The radio operator sat in the corner where he'd been restrained, zip-tied and silent, but his eyes were moving, watching the tree line, watching the other soldiers, watching something, waiting for something. The first RPG came in at 8:41 hours and 37 seconds. It screamed out of the eastern ridge like a meteor, trailing white smoke, and detonated against the rear supply truck with a flash that turned the world white and a concussion that rattled teeth even 3 vehicles forward. The explosion was enormous, perfectly placed, exactly the kind of opening shot a professional kill team would use to create maximum chaos and psychological impact. The jungle exploded. Gunfire erupted from 2 ridgelines simultaneously, controlled, disciplined, aimed. AK-47 fire from the western ridge, walking across the convoy in practiced bursts. Heavy machine gun fire from elevated positions on the east, tracers arcing down in brilliant red lines that cut through the morning mist. RPG teams firing from concealment, targeting specific vehicles, trying to disable the convoy's ability to maneuver. Red Serpent was good. Despite everything Ghost Orchid had done to their forward observation network, despite the losses they'd already taken, they were still professional soldiers executing a well-rehearsed plan with deadly precision. Under normal circumstances, Iron Shepherd would have been finished within 4 minutes. But Hollis noticed it in the second minute. Something was wrong with the enemy fire pattern. The shooting from the northern ridge was sporadic, disorganized. Positions that should have had overlapping fields of fire were responding late, or not at all. He could see muzzle flashes appearing and then going dark without explanation. Bodies were dropping from elevated perches in the tree line without any return fire from the convoy reaching those positions. Just disappearing. One by one, silently, with a precision that felt almost methodical. He watched through his rifle scope as an NVA machine gunner on the eastern ridge set up his position, brought his weapon to bear on the convoy, and then simply collapsed forward over his gun without firing a single shot. No visible impact, no sound that carried over the roar of the firefight. The man was there, and then he wasn't, replaced by a shape that didn't move. Ghost Orchid was working. She was somewhere up in that chaos, moving through the canopy like smoke, firing from positions that gave her sight lines the enemy couldn't predict, systematically eliminating the shooters who posed the greatest threat to the convoy. She was doing it in the middle of a full-scale firefight, with bullets filling the air and explosions shaking the trees, threading shots through conditions that would have made most snipers pack up and retreat. And she wasn't missing. Inside the lead vehicle, Mercer made the decision that would either save them or doom them. All vehicles pushed through, Do not stop. Do not return fire unless you have a ground-level threat. Drive fast and trust the high ground. It went against every tactical instinct, driving deeper into an ambush rather than finding cover and returning fire. But conventional tactics assumed conventional support. They didn't have conventional support. They had something else entirely. They had a ghost with a rifle who was rewriting the rules in real time. The convoy accelerated, engines roaring, vehicles bouncing violently over broken road surface as speed took priority over everything else. Soldiers gripped their rifles and held on, some returning fire at visible threats, others simply trying to stay inside the vehicles as they lurched and swerved. In the second vehicle, Corporal Tully made his final play. He'd been watching, waiting, looking for the moment when everyone's attention was focused outward on the ambush rather than inward on him. The moment came when an RPG detonated 15 meters from their vehicle, close enough that the concussion rattled the chassis and threw everyone sideways. In that moment of chaos, Tully twisted his body with desperate flexibility and drove his shoulder into Ray's back, knocking him forward. His hands were still zip-tied, but his legs weren't. He'd been working the ankle restraints for the past 20 minutes, flexing and twisting until the plastic had stretched just enough. He kicked hard, connecting with the radio equipment, sending it clattering across the floor. "He's loose," someone shouted, but the words were lost in the roar of another explosion. Holly spun from the window, rifle swinging around, but the interior of the vehicle was too cramped for clear shots. Bodies everywhere, equipment scattered, everyone struggling to maintain position as the vehicle bounced over broken ground. Tully lunged for the secondary radio, the one thing he needed to reach, the one last transmission he could make that would give Red Serpent the information they desperately needed. The convoy's exact position, speed, formation. Everything required to adjust fire and finish what they'd started. His bound hands closed around the microphone. Hollis threw himself forward, covering the distance between them in one desperate lunge. His shoulder hit Tully mid-body with the force of a linebacker, driving them both into the vehicle's metal wall hard enough to dent it. The radio slipped from Tully's grasp. Hollis grabbed it, yanked the entire unit free from its mounting, and hurled it out the open window into the jungle. Tully made an animal sound, rage and desperation, and the realization that his last option had just vanished. He twisted underneath Hollis, getting one leg free, driving his knee up into Hollis's ribs with enough force that something cracked audibly. Hollis grunted, vision going white at the edges, but he didn't let go. His hands found Tully's throat and squeezed. Not to kill, just to control, to subdue, to stop the thrashing that was endangering everyone in the confined space. Ray's recovered and dropped down hard on Tully's legs, pinning them. Another soldier grabbed Tully's arms, forcing them back against his body despite the zip ties. They held him there, 3 men restraining one, using weight and leverage and sheer determination until Tully finally stopped struggling and went limp, breathing hard, eyes wild but body defeated. "Stay down," Hollis growled, blood running from his mouth where he'd been hit earlier. "Or I swear to God I will throw you out after that radio." Tully said nothing, just stared at the ceiling with the flat, empty expression of someone who had bet everything on a single play and watched it fail. Outside, the firefight reached its crescendo. Red Serpent was adapting, trying to compensate for the losses Ghost Orchid was inflicting, repositioning teams, adjusting fields of fire. But they were doing it without their forward observers, without their heavy weapons coordinator, without half the positions they'd planned to use. The ambush that should have been a surgical execution had devolved into a chaotic gunfight where the defenders had more information than the attackers. Then Ghost Orchid made the shot. It came from somewhere on the northern ridge, high and distant, a position that gave her sight lines down into Red Serpent's command position on the eastern slope. The field commander, A veteran NVA officer named Nguyen Van Duck, who had survived 3 years of war through skill and caution, was positioned behind cover that should have been perfect, elevated, concealed, with clear views of the entire kill zone. He never saw her, never heard the shot, never knew what hit him. The bullet traveled 830 meters through rain, through smoke from burning vehicles, through jungle canopy that should have deflected or slowed it. It found the 6-inch gap in his cover and took him in the upper chest with the kind of precision that transcended skill and entered the realm of something close to impossible. He dropped without a sound, and with him went Red Serpent's ability to coordinate. The enemy fire stuttered. Units that had been operating as a cohesive whole suddenly became isolated elements trying to make decisions without direction. Some kept firing, burning through ammunition on targets they couldn't effectively hit. Some tried to reposition, exposing themselves to ghost orchid sight lines. Some simply stopped, confused by the silence from positions that should have been commanding them. Iron Shepherd drove through it all like a blade through water, not unscathed, never unscathed, but moving, surviving, refusing to stop. Private Chen took shrapnel from an RPG that detonated against the third vehicle's armor plating. Specialist Morrison caught a rifle round in the shoulder that went clean through without hitting anything vital. The rear supply truck was burning but still rolling, driver white-knuckling the wheel while flames licked up from the cargo bed. 2 wounded, 1 vehicle compromised, 41 men still combat effective. The firefight lasted 11 minutes and 47 seconds from first shot to last. Then, as if someone had given a silent signal that only the enemy could hear, the shooting stopped. Not gradually, all at once. Like a switch being flipped, like an organism dying. The last muzzle flash disappeared from the eastern ridge. The last RPG team abandoned their position and melted back into the jungle. Red Serpent broke contact and withdrew, leaving behind their dead, their equipment, and the shattered remains of an ambush that should have been perfect. Iron Shepherd emerged from the far end of Devil's Notch at 8:52 hours and rolled into open terrain with engines smoking and soldiers breathing hard, and every man aboard trying to process the fact that they'd just survived something that should have killed them all. Mercer sat in the driver's seat with rain hammering the windshield and his hands still locked on the wheel. His ears were ringing. His throat was raw from shouting orders. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been wound too tight for too long. He picked up the backup radio with hands that were finally starting to shake, held down the transmit key, and clicked it 3 times. Silence. 10 seconds of nothing but static and rain. Then 3 clicks back, faint, distant, already moving away. Then nothing at all. She was gone. Firebase Longbow appeared through the tree line at 9:12 hours like a promise nobody had believed would be kept. The convoy rolled through the gate with the particular exhausted dignity of men who had gone somewhere terrible and come back, vehicles scarred with bullet impacts and shrapnel scoring, uniforms soaked through with rain and sweat, and in some cases blood, eyes carrying the specific weight of a night and morning that would never fully leave them. The rear supply truck was still smoking, flames finally extinguished, but the smell of burning diesel and scorched metal hanging in the air like a ghost. Soldiers dismounted slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of people checking to make sure all their parts still worked. Some limped. Some helped others who limped worse. Private Chen was bleeding through the field, dressing on his side but walking under his own power, refusing the stretcher until a medic physically put him on it. Specialist Morrison sat on the running board of the third vehicle holding his shoulder and staring at nothing, processing the fact that he'd been shot and was somehow still alive. Medical personnel swarmed the wounded with professional efficiency, triage conducted in seconds, priorities assigned. Men moved to the aid station in order of need rather than order of rank. Firebase Longbow had been expecting casualties. They'd been briefed on Operation Iron Shepherd's route through contested territory. What they hadn't been briefed on was how any of these men were still breathing, MPs appeared and took custody of Corporal Tully without ceremony or explanation. He was pulled from the second vehicle still zip-tied, face blank, saying nothing. No protests. No attempts to explain or justify. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and everyone involved knew it. They walked him to a holding area and locked the door, and that was the last time most of Iron Shepherd would see him before he disappeared into the machinery of military justice. The classified cargo, the reinforced crate that had been worth 43 lives and a convoy driven straight through a professional ambush, was offloaded from the second vehicle by two men in civilian clothes who had been waiting since the previous evening. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't ask about the convoy's condition. Just verified the serial numbers, signed a transfer document that had no agency letterhead, and loaded the crate into an unmarked truck that rolled out of Firebase Longbow within 4 minutes. Mercer watched them leave and felt nothing. The cargo was someone else's problem now. His responsibility ended the moment it cleared the gate intact. The debrief was called for 1100 hours in the operations building, a prefab structure that smelled like mildew and old coffee, walls covered with maps marked with tactical overlays and unit positions that were already outdated. Mercer sat across from a CIA officer in a wrinkled linen shirt who had the kind of face that never seemed to record anything, features designed professionally for forgetting, eyes that looked at people the way accountants looked at numbers. The officer's name was never given. That told Mercer everything he needed to know about how this conversation would go. Convoy encountered hostile contact at Devil's Notch, the officer said, reading from a file that appeared to contain about 3 pages. Enemy force estimated at squad strength. Iron Shepherd successfully fought through and delivered the cargo with 2 wounded, no KIA, minimal vehicle damage. Exemplary performance under fire. Mercer said nothing, just watched the man's face and waited. There will be commendations, the officer continued. Captain Mercer for leadership under fire, Staff Sergeant Hollies for neutralizing an internal security threat, the unit as a whole for mission completion in hostile territory. He set the file down and folded his hands on the table in a gesture that looked casual but wasn't. Is there anything you'd like to add to the official record? This was the moment. The question that sounded like an invitation but was actually a test. Mercer thought about the woman who had materialized from a refugee crowd with a canvas sack and a cracked doll. Thought about her assembling a rifle in 87 seconds with the kind of muscle memory that came from doing something 1,000 times in the dark. Thought about the bodies dropping from elevated positions in complete silence while an entire firefight raged around them. Thought about a shot through 800 meters of jungle and rain that killed a man who should have been impossible to hit. He thought about Ghost Orchid and what it meant that someone like that could exist and operate and save 43 lives and then simply disappear as if she'd never been there at all. Sniper on the ridge, Mercer said carefully. The one who eliminated Red Serpent's command structure. Officer's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a warning, or maybe just recognition that Mercer understood the game being played. He shook his head once, slowly. Final. Captain, there was no sniper on the ridge. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Mercer held the man's gaze for a long moment, reading the message underneath the message. This is how this works. This is how this has always worked. Some things don't get written down. 43 men made it through Devil's Notch this morning, Mercer said quietly. Yes, the officer agreed. They did, because of excellent unit leadership, solid tactical discipline, and favorable conditions. He unfolded his hands and picked up a pen, making a small notation in the file. Your unit performed exceptionally well under fire, Captain. You should be proud of what your men accomplished. Emphasis on your men was subtle but clear. The narrative was already being written, and it didn't include a woman who technically didn't exist doing things that officially hadn't happened. There will be no supplemental report filed, the officer continued. No additional names added to the debrief record. No classified annexes. Is that understood? It wasn't really a question. Mercer nodded once. Understood. He was dismissed 40 minutes later with a commendation pending, mission status marked complete, and a strong suggestion that he and his men take 72 hours of stand-down time to recover before their next assignment. Everything neat, everything accounted for, everything except the part that actually mattered. Mercer walked out into the afternoon heat and found Hollis waiting near the operations building, leaning against a post with a cigarette finally lit, looking at nothing in particular. They stood in silence for a moment, the comfortable kind that came from men who'd gone through something together and didn't need to explain it to each other. "They tell you to forget?" Hollis asked eventually. "They told me there was nothing to remember," Mercer replied. Hollis took a long drag and blew smoke toward the jungle. "That's not the same thing." "No, it's not." They stood there a while longer, and then Mercer walked alone to the firebase's western perimeter where the cleared ground met the tree line. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a moment away from all the official silences and institutional forgetting that seemed to be the only language this war spoke when it came to the things that really mattered. He found the canvas sack hanging from a wooden post at the edge of the tree line. It swayed slightly in the breeze, empty, sun-faded, carefully placed on a post that had probably been used for 100 different purposes since the firebase was built. The cracked porcelain doll sat at the base of the post, propped carefully against the wood with its broken face turned toward the jungle, positioned with the same precise intention that characterized everything Ghost Orchid had done. Both were empty. Both were clean. Both were left behind with the quiet finality of things that had served their purpose and were no longer needed. Mercer crouched down and picked up the doll, turning it over in his hands. The crack ran diagonally across the porcelain face, and one painted eye was chipped away to bare ceramic beneath. Some child had loved this once, carried it, treasured it, and then lost it, and someone else had picked it up and carried it for different reasons entirely. He set it back down carefully, the same way she had left it, as if disturbing it felt like disturbing something sacred. Behind him, Hollis had followed and now stood at his shoulder, looking at the canvas sack and the doll and the jungle beyond. Neither man spoke for a long time. "You think she's already gone?" Hollis asked eventually. "She was never here," Mercer said quietly, and it was true in every way that mattered. There would be no after-action report mentioning her, no commendation with her name, no notation in any file that would ever be declassified. The 43 men of Iron Shepherd would go home eventually, some sooner, some later, some not at all, and they would tell people about the convoy that drove through an ambush and came out the other side. But they wouldn't tell anyone about the woman with the doll, because who would believe them? Who would believe that someone like that existed outside of novels and myths, and the stories soldiers told each other when they'd been in the jungle too long? Hollis finished his cigarette and ground it out under his boot. "Every man in that convoy knows what she did." "Yeah," Mercer said. "They do. That ought to count for something." "Maybe it does." Mercer stood up, brushing dust from his hands. "Maybe that's enough." They walked back toward the center of the firebase together, leaving the canvas sack and the doll at the edge of the tree line like a memorial to something that officially hadn't happened. The afternoon sun beat down through gaps in the canopy. Somewhere in the distance, helicopters were landing with supplies and replacements and news from other parts of the war that was consuming everything it touched. And somewhere deep in the Vietnam jungle, moving through shadow and silence like she had been born from it, Ghost Orchid was already gone. No footprint, no record, no name on any wall that would ever be built to honor the people this war consumed, and the people it quietly, invisibly saved. She had never been on the convoy manifest, never appeared in the debrief, never existed in any history book printed before or since. But 43 men had gone into Devil's Notch that morning under fire from professional soldiers with perfect positions and superior numbers, and 43 men had come out. They went home to their families eventually, some whole, some broken, all changed. They had children and careers and lives that stretched out long after the war ended, and the jungle faded from nightly news into history books. And until their very last breath, every single one of them remembered the refugee with the cracked porcelain doll who had walked among the nameless and saved them all. The
Non so.
jungle kept its secrets. It always
Ho
did.
sbagliato, non fa
But some secrets were worth
non fa
keeping.
niente.
The end.
Gioco The Long Dark, quello che stavo facendo vedere prima. Il sabato è il giorno peggiore dopo il mercoledì. Ma che cazzo dici? Ma com'è possibile? Farei anche professionale. Non è ragioneria. Come fa a essere ragioneria? Ehm, come fa a essere il secondo giorno peggiore, Ire? Io ricordo che al sabato facevo dalle 8 alle 12. E se sei qui